Shostakovich in Casablanca. Although, of course, the perverse position of the instrument of the big other was reserved for the members of the nomenklatura, ordinary Soviet citizens were not reduced to the simple alternative of believers or non-believers. The split that characterized their predominant subjective position was of a different nature. Recall the debate about the true message of Shostakovich's work that raged in musicological circles until recently. Where did the composer truly stand with regard to his, obviously tortured, relationship to communism? The two opposed positions are that, in spite of all his obvious doubts and oscillations, Shostakovich was a faithful Soviet composer, or that in fact Shostakovich was a closet dissident, whose music presents disguised or coded challenges to the very political system he pretended to endorse. In the second case, we get caught in the interpretive madness in which every feature can be interpreted as a sign of its opposite. Complain that the triumphant ending of the Leningrad Symphony was banal, and you might get the response, but it's meant to be banal. The message conveyed was what mattered. It is thus only a thin line of reflexivity that separates the two readings. If banality is self-declaratory, if it is meant as such, then it cancels itself and reverts into irony. Where then does the truth reside? What I propose is a Hegelian synthesis of these opposed views, albeit a synthesis with an unexpected twist. What if what makes Shostakovich's music Stalinist, part of the Soviet universe, is his very distance towards it? What if a distance towards the official ideological universe, far from undermining it, was a key constituent of its functioning? Shostakovich's spontaneously intimate attitude towards politics is probably best expressed in his remark to a friend. Do you not think that history is really a whore? This generalized distrust of all politics, which also grounds his distance towards dissidents, such as Solzhenitsyn, made his survival much easier. The crucial insight compels us to give a specific twist to the standard argument for Shostakovich's dissidents. Even the most official writers were, more often than not, privately skeptical about the Soviet regime and known to be within the dissident culture. It is indeed rare to find Russian writers under Soviet rule, however officially sanctioned or ostensibly conformist, who did not, at one time or other, voice a critical outlook on Soviet reality. Shostakovich was also uniquely active in forwarding dissident values in his work, an enterprise substantially protected by the deniability inherent in non-verbal dissidence. But he was in no sense alone in privately maintaining a dissenting outlook on Soviet life, while at the same time necessarily giving a contrary public impression of conformism. So why did Stalin not liquidate Shostakovich and many other leading figures from Akhmatova to Pasternak, whose views were transparently dissident? In the case of poets, Stalin's superstition seems to have played a part, but the main answer is that major figures could not be liquidated without causing foreign uproar. It looks really bad for a line of reasoning which has to go so far as to evoke Stalin's superstition. Is it not much easier and more logical to admit that the gap between public allegiance to the regime and private dissidence was part of the very identity of the Stalinist subject? If there is a lesson to be learned from the functioning of Stalinist ideology, it is that public appearances matter, which is why one should reserve the category dissidents exclusively for the public discourse. Dissidents were only those who disturbed the smooth functioning of the public discourse, announcing publicly, in one way or another, what, privately, everybody already knew. Was, however, such a subjective position the only one possible, if one wanted to survive, of course? The fate of Sergei Prokofiev, the other great name of Soviet music, shows a radically different path. In his disputed memoirs, Dmitri Shostakovich dismissed Sergei Prokofiev his great competitor, as refusing to take historical horrors seriously, always playing the wise guy. However, to name just one supreme example, Prokofiev's First Violin Sonata, Opus 80, clearly demonstrates the obverse of Prokofiev's infamous irony. Throughout its four movements, one senses a powerful undertow of struggle. Yet it is not the struggle of a work against something outside itself, but rather the struggle of something within the work, unmanifested, trying desperately to break out and constantly finding its emergence blocked by the existing outward form and language of the piece. This blocking of something within hath to do with the frustration of a desire for cathartic release into some supremely positive state of being, where meaning, musical and supramusical, is transparent, unironizable. In short, a domain of spiritual purity. It is here that Prokofiev pays the price for his ironic stance, and it is such passages that bear witness to his artistic integrity. Far from signaling any kind of vain intellectual superiority, this ironic stance is just the falsely bright obverse of the failure of Prokofiev's constant struggle to bring the thing from inner space, the something within, out. The superficial playfulness of some of Prokofiev's works, such as his popular First Symphony, merely signals in a negative way the fact that Prokofiev is the ultimate anti-Mozart, a kind of Beethoven whose titanic struggle ended in disaster. If Mozart was the supreme musical genius, perhaps the last composer with whom the musical thing transposed itself into musical notes in a spontaneous flow, and if in Beethoven a piece only achieved its definitive form after a long, heroic struggle with the musical material, Prokofiev's greatest pieces are monuments to the defeat of this struggle. Shostakovich never reached the level of such an imminent failure. His piece, which can be compared to Prokofiev's First Violin Sonata, in its exceptional subjectively engaged intensity, is, of course, his String Quartet No. 8, and the difference between the two pieces is striking. Whatever subjective anguish is detectable beneath the quartet, its musical expression flows unhindered, pouring out and generating an easily recognizable emotional impact. Shostakovich's life and subjective experience may have been thwarted, marked by depressions and terrible and debasing compromises, but this blockade does not affect his musical expression. In Prokofiev's Violin Sonata, on the contrary, we are dealing with a much more radical, imminent blockage of musical expression itself. The tragic failure is here the failure of the form itself, and this failure accounts for the inner truth missing in Shostakovich. In the last decade and a half of his life, Prokofiev was caught up in the Stalinist superego at its purest. Whatever he did was wrong. When he stuck to his modernist roots, he was accused of anti-people formalism and bourgeois decadence. When, thereafter, he tried to do his best to bow to the pressure in his infamous Cantata for the 20th anniversary of the October Revolution, using texts by Marx, Lenin, and Stalin, the cantata was again criticized for leftist deviation and vulgarity. That is, for dragging Marx and Lenin into it. Desperate to contribute something, anything, to the 20th anniversary, Prokofiev quickly threw together a concoction of folk tunes and party sing-alongs entitled Songs of Our Days. The work was again dismissed as pale and lacking in individuality, which, of course, was true. Prokofiev must by now have been utterly bewildered. If he wrote like a simpleton, he was a depersonalized left deviationist. If he wrote like Prokofiev, he was a mercenary formalist. Individual, non-individual, there must have seemed no rhyme or reason to it, and of course, none existed. But there definitely was a rhyme and reason to it, the rhyme and reason of the Stalinist superego, in the eyes of which one is always guilty. However, the problem was a deeper one. The paradox of Prokofiev's late style was that the logic of his imminent musical development, which led him away from expressionist pathos towards new simplicity, strangely reverberated with the official demands for the easy-listening music accessible to ordinary Soviet people. In the case of Prokofiev, as well as in that of Shostakovich, the reason why critics so desperately look for the ultimate proof of secret dissidence is to avoid a highly embarrassing truth. their most popular works today in the West overlap to a surprising degree with the very works which got the greatest official, not only popular support, from the regime. Shostakovich's 5th, 7th, and 11th symphonies, Prokofiev's Peter and the Wolf, and the Romeo and Juliet ballet. Even among Shostakovich's chamber music, his piano quintet, which got the Stalin Prize in 1940, is his most popular piece. How can this be? Here enters the hermeneutics of dissidence, which shows the escape route. Shostakovich's 5th Symphony, the most often performed 20th century symphony also in the West. It has to be the case that the triumphant finale is really meant ironically, mocking the emptiness of Stalinist triumphalism. The enduring popularity of the 7th Symphony, the Leningrad, it has to be that the inexorable brutal marching progress in the first movement does not really refer to the German conquest of Russia in 1941, but to the communist conquest of Russia. Shostakovich's 11th Symphony, 1905, a hit? It has to be quickly confirmed that 1905 is just a pretext, that the revolutionary explosion really refers to Hungary in 1956. But what about the Shostakovich symphonies, which were effectively unacceptable for those in power, like the 13th, Babi Yar, and the last, the 15th? The answer is clear. In a supreme twist of irony, the 13th caused such a stir at its premiere precisely and only because of the political circumstances. It functioned as a gesture of political defiance, not because of its artistic strength. These works are today respected and praised, but not really enjoyed. The publicity text for the new recording of Shostakovich's first violin concerto by Leila Josefowicz says that she pays homage to the struggle Shostakovich faced under Stalin's regime. The patent absurdity of this claim confirms Michael Tanner's thesis that there is almost no other composer for whom the life and works mélange has achieved such orthodox status. Tanner is fully justified in pointing out how the endless debates regarding how some symphony movements are to be read, with serious pathos or as ironic subversion, or regarding which victorious finales are meant to render the victories Pyrrhic, tell us in fact what the music itself fails to achieve. There is no greater monument to Shostakovich's artistic failure than the obsessive search for some private, extra-artistic document that would definitely prove his intimate anti-communist stance. This is why, in the ambiguities in which this politically engaged background no longer resonates, Shostakovich's music is simply uninterestingly enigmatic. Like the references to Rossini and Wagner in the last symphony, there is no deeper meaning to be discovered here. The enigma is musically flat. The irony here is that the very search for the extra-musical smoking gun demonstrates the truth of the Stalinist accusation about the formalist character of Shostakovich's music. Not, of course, in the sense in which it was intended by Zhdanov, a consort, but in the sense that his music is neutral with regard to social commitments, which is why one has to look for extra-musical signs to pin it down. So what if we read Shostakovich's popular symphonies along the lines of how we might read one of the great Hollywood classics? In the well-known brief scene 3/4 into Casablanca, Ilse Lund, Ingrid Bergman, comes to Rick Blaine's, Humphrey Bogart's room to try to obtain the letters of transit that will allow her and her resistance leader husband, Victor Lajlo, to escape from Casablanca to Portugal and then to America. After Rick refuses to hand them over, she pulls a gun and threatens him. He tells her, "Go ahead and shoot, you'll be doing me a favor." She breaks down and tearfully starts to tell him the story of why she left him in Paris. By the time she says, "If you knew how much I loved you, how much I still love you," they are embracing in a close-up. The movie dissolves into a 3.5-second shot of the airport tower at night, its searchlights circling, and then dissolves back to a shot from outside the window of Rick's room, where he is standing, looking out and smoking a cigarette. He turns round and says, "And then?" She resumes her story. The question that immediately pops up here, of course, is what happened in between, during the 3.5-second shot of the airport? Did they do it or not? Maltby is right to emphasize that, as to this point, the film is not simply ambiguous. It rather generates two very clear, although mutually exclusive meanings. They did it, and they did not do it. That is, the film gives unambiguous signals that they did it, and simultaneously unambiguous signals that they cannot have done it. On the one hand, a series of codified features signal that they did do it, namely that the 3.5-second shot stands for a longer period of time. The dissolve of the couple passionately embracing usually signals the act after the fade-out. The cigarette is also the standard sign of post-coital relaxation, up to the vulgar phallic connotation of the tower. On the other hand, a parallel series of features signals that they did not do it, namely that the 3.5-second shot of the airport tower corresponds to the real diegetic time. The bed in the background is undisturbed. The same conversation seems to go on without a break, and so on. Even when, in the final conversation between Rick and Laszlo at the airport, they directly touch on the events of this night, their words can be read in both ways. Rick: You said you knew about Ilse and me. Victor: Yes. Rick: You didn't know she was at my place last night when you were. She came there for the letters of transit. Isn't that true, Ilse? Ilse: Yes. Rick: She tried everything to get them, and nothing worked. She did her best to convince me that she was still in love with me. That was all over long ago. For your sake, she pretended it wasn't, and I let her pretend. Victor: I understand. Well, I certainly do not understand. Is Rick saying to Victor that he made love to his wife, or not? Maltby's solution is to insist that this scene provided an exemplary case of how Casablanca deliberately constructs itself in such a way as to offer distinct and alternative sources of pleasure to two people sitting next to each other in the same cinema. That is, that it could play to both innocent and sophisticated audiences alike. While at the level of its surface narrative line, the film can be constructed by the spectator as obeying the strictest moral codes, it simultaneously offers to the sophisticated enough clues to construct an alternative, sexually much more daring narrative line. This strategy is more complex than it may appear, precisely because you knew that you are, as it were, covered or absolved from guilty impulses by the official storyline. You are allowed to indulge in dirty fantasies. You know that these fantasies are not serious, that they do not count in the eyes of the big other. So our only correction to Maltby would be that we do not need two spectators sitting next to each other. One and the same spectator, split in two, is sufficient. To put it in Lacanian terms, during the infamous 3.5 seconds, Ilse and Rick did not do it for the big other, the order of public appearance, but they did do it for our dirty, phantasmatic imagination. This is the structure of inherent transgression at its purest. That is, Hollywood needs both levels in order to function. To put it in terms of the discourse theory elaborated by Oswald Ducrot, we have here the opposition between presupposition and surmise. The presupposition of a statement is directly endorsed by the big other. We are not responsible for it, while the responsibility for the surmise of a statement rests entirely on the reader's or spectator's shoulders. The author of the text can always claim, it's not my responsibility if the spectators draw dirty conclusions from the texture of the film. And to link this to psychoanalytic terms, this opposition is, of course, the opposition between symbolic law, the ego ideal, and the obscene superego. At the level of the public symbolic law, nothing happens. The text is clean, while at another level, it bombards the spectator with the superego injunction, enjoy. That is, give way to your dirty imagination. To put it in yet another way, what we encounter here is a clear example of the fetishistic split, of the disavowal structure of je sais bien, mais quand même. The very awareness that they did not do it gives free rein to your dirty imagination. You can indulge in it because you are absolved from the guilt by the fact that, for the big other, they definitely did not do it. And this double reading is not simply a compromise on the part of the law, in the sense that the symbolic law is interested only in keeping up appearances and leaves you free to exercise your fantasies, insofar as they do not encroach upon the public domain, namely insofar as they save the appearances. The law itself needs its obscene supplement. It is sustained by it, so it generates it. Maltby is thus right in emphasizing that the infamous Hollywood production code of the 1930s and 1940s was not simply a negative censorship code, but also a positive, productive, as Foucault would have put it, codification and regulation that generated the very excess whose direct depiction it hindered. Indicative here is the conversation between Josef von Sternberg and Breen, reported by Maltby. When Sternberg said, "At this point, the two principals have a brief romantic interlude," Breen interrupted him. "What you're trying to say is that the two of them hopped into the hay. They fucked." The indignant Sternberg answered, "Mr. Breen, you offend me." Breen, "Oh, for Christ's sakes, will you stop the horseshit and face the issue? We can help you make a story about adultery if you want, but not if you keep calling a good screwing match a romantic interlude. Now, what do these two people do? Kiss and go home?" "No," said Sternberg. "They fuck." "Good," yelped Breen, pounding the desk. "Now I can understand your story." The director completed his outline, and Breen told him how he could handle it in such a way as to get past the code. So the very prohibition, in order to function properly, has to rely on a clear awareness about what really happened at the level of the prohibited narrative line. The production code did not simply prohibit some content, it rather codified its ciphered articulation. And back to Shostakovich, what if exactly the same holds for his popular symphonies? What if they also operate at two levels simultaneously? One public, intended for the ruling ideological gaze, and another which transgresses the public rules, but remains as such, its inherent supplement. One can thus appreciate the ambiguity of these lines. Since the Stalinist assault against his music in 1936, Shostakovich had developed a sort of doublespeak in his musical language, using one idiom to please his masters in the Kremlin and another to satisfy his own moral conscience as an artist and citizen. Outwardly he spoke in a triumphant voice, yet beneath the ritual sounds of Soviet rejoicing there was a softer, more melancholic voice, the carefully concealed voice of satire and dissent, only audible to those who had felt the suffering his music expressed. These two voices are clearly audible in Shostakovich's Fifth Symphony, which received a half-hour ovation of electrifying force when it was first performed. Beneath the endless fanfares, trumpeting the triumph of the Soviet state in the finale, the audience must have felt its sadness, and they responded to the music as a spiritual release. A strange hermeneutics indeed, a carefully concealed voice which is nonetheless clearly understood by thousands. Were the official censors really so stupid as not to get it? So, what if we read the fragile coexistence of these two idioms along the lines of the ambiguity inscribed into the Night Encounter scene from Casablanca? What if the Stalinist rejection of both Prokofiev's propagandistic and intimate works was right on its own terms? What if what they wanted from him was precisely the coexistence of two levels, propagandistic and intimate, while he was offering them either the first or the second? After World War II, Prokofiev withdrew increasingly to the intimate domain of chamber music, where he could find expression for his private sadness. Was this an act of silent defiance, writing music for the drawer, as Shostakovich would have put it? How is it then that the most moving and desperate of these works, his violin sonata in D major, whose haunting opening movement was meant to sound like the wind in a graveyard, was awarded the Stalin Prize in 1947? Orlando Figues claims that the award was meant ironically, but what kind of strange irony is this? Let us return to Shostakovich. Can we really be so sure that the public bombast music is meant ironically, while the intimate confessional mood is meant sincerely? What if the irony is objective, and we have to read this music in the same way Marx read the attitude of the Party of Order in the French Parliament after the 1848 Revolution? Recall Marx's coruscating analysis of how this conservative Republican Party functioned as the coalition of the two branches of royalism, Orleanists and Legitimists, in the anonymous kingdom of the Republic. The parliamentary deputies of the Party of Order perceived their republicanism as mockery. In parliamentary debates, they generated royalist slips of the tongue and ridiculed the Republic to let it be known that their true aim was to restore the king. What they were not aware of is that they themselves were duped as to the true social impact of their rule. They unknowingly established the conditions of the bourgeois Republican order that they despise so much, by, for instance, guaranteeing private property. So it is not that they were royalists who were just wearing Republican masks. Although they thought of themselves as such, it was their inner royalist conviction which was the deceptive front masking their true social role. In short, far from being the hidden truth of their public republicanism. Their sincere royalism was the phantasmatic support of their actual republicanism. It was what provided the passion for their activity. Is it not then that the deputies of the Party of Order were also feigning to feign to be Republicans, to be what they really were, in exactly the same way that Shostakovich was feigning to be a faithful communist? Nonetheless, the subjective position of Prokofiev is here radically different from that of Shostakovich. One can propose the thesis that, in contrast to Shostakovich, Prokofiev was effectively not a Soviet composer, even if he wrote more than Shostakovich's share of official cantatas celebrating Stalin and his regime. Prokofiev adopted a kind of proto-psychotic position of internal exclusion towards Stalinism. He was not internally affected or bothered by it, that is, he treated it as just an external nuisance. There was effectively something childish in Prokofiev, like the refusal of a spoilt child to accept one's place in the social order of things. He returned to the Soviet Union in 1936 at the height of the Stalinist purges, drove around in his imported American car, dressed eccentrically in fancy clothes delivered from Paris, ordered books and food from the West, ignoring the madness and poverty around him. This is why, in contrast to Shostakovich, he never really got into the Stalinist superego double-talk idiom of combining external accommodation with inner bitterness and sadness. Even the melancholy and despair of his late violin sonata is not a reaction to Stalinist oppression. The same style and mood are there already in his pre-revolutionary works. The different reaction of the two composers to Zhdanov's attacks in 1946-47 is exemplary here. Prokofiev simply did not understand what the charges were about. He did not internalize the tension. When, in 1947, he was forced to attend a meeting of the Composers' Union and to listen to Zhdanov's speech attacking him and other Soviet composers, he arrived drunk, made loud, rude comments interrupting the speech, and then fell asleep on his chair in the midst of it. Miraculously, nothing happened. So accepted was his eccentricity. And Shostakovich? The popularity and public resonance of his music underwent a weird change. A couple of decades ago, the majority of critics dismissed him as a socialist realist, out of touch with the proper development of modern music. However, today, the great musical modernists such as Schoenberg and Webern are perceived as a thing of the past, respectfully ignored, while Shostakovich has emerged as arguably the most popular, serious composer of the 20th century. Dozens of volumes were written not only about his music, but also about his closet dissidents. What if, however, Shostakovich's popularity is the sign of a non-event, of the occultation of the true event of modern music? Broadly, a moment of the vast cultural counter-revolution whose political mark is the withdrawal from radical emancipatory politics and the refocusing on human rights and the prevention of suffering.